Hello, my name is Stephen Friedman, and this is my final project presentation for Political Science Class 394. The State of the Union speech that I've chosen to analyze is Donald Trump's 2018 address. This was his first speech after having had a full year in the executive office. I chose this speech because I knew it was recent enough that there would be ample fact-checking and analysis available from both liberal and conservative sources. The speech itself is almost an hour and a half long and has a whopping 123 breaks for applause. Fact check and analysis. As per our instructions, I chose 20 separate statements of fact that the president made during the speech. I then cross-referenced them with 4 different fact-checking sources: NPR, The New York Times, PolitiFact, and factcheck.org. Of those 20, I found 12 to be true or mostly true, and 8 that were false or at least very misleading. An example of a true statement would be this.
And something I'm very proud of. African American unemployment stands at the lowest rate ever recorded.
That statement is true. At the time, the unemployment rate for African Americans was at the lowest ever recorded. An example of a false statement or a misleading one would be this.
We are now very proudly an exporter of energy to the world.
The fact is that while we had been exporting coal for a very long time, the only now thing that had happened was that we had just become net exporters of natural gas. But we still imported more oil, so in comparison, we were net importers of energy, not exporters. Also, there were statements that were technically true but fairly misleading, such as, since the election, we've created 2.4 million jobs. The president does say since the election, and that's because the only way to get to that 2.4 million number is to count the last 3 months of Obama's presidency, as well as the first year of his own. Technically true, but a little misleading, as he seems to take credit for some work that happened before he even took office.
The conservative-liberal analysis comparison. After fact-checking the speech, I went to look and see how conservative and liberal sources were covering the speech. Truth be told, I had a very hard time finding any conservative fact-checking of the speech, but I eventually did find an article by the Daily Signal that analyzed the speech. The Daily Signal is ranked as a highly partisan right-wing source according to the media bias chart that we got at the beginning of our course. To my surprise, I also had a hard time finding liberal articles as well. Typically, highly liberal sources like the Huffington Post didn't have any in-depth coverage that I could find online. I did find plenty of fact-checking, though, and I decided to use a Washington Post article that was both fact-checked and offered some analysis of the speech. As expected, the conservative Daily Signal lauded the president's speech. The first line from their article is, "President Trump is right. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is providing tremendous relief for the American people." That right there set the tone for an article that did absolutely nothing to call out the president for the false statements he made, although, to be fair, they did criticize him occasionally for not going far enough in certain areas like tax reform.
The Washington Post's coverage was also highly biased, in my opinion. Their article focused exclusively on the faulty information that the president had stated, and even attempted to poke holes in the factual statements that he made. For example, on the unemployment rate, they said, "This is a flip-flop by Trump. During the 2016 campaign, Trump used to claim a 4 Pinocchio statistic that 58% of African American youths were unemployed. The official Bureau of Labor Statistics unemployment rate for black youth at the time was 19.2%, about 1/3 of the rate used by Trump. Now that he's president, Trump appears all too happy to cite the unemployment rate for African Americans, bragging that it's the best since the turn of the century." So rather than admit that he had made a factually correct statement, they attacked him for previous comments regarding African American unemployment. The word cloud. In creating the word cloud for this address, I split the speech into 2 parts because the tone of the speech changes between when the president's talking about his past year accomplishments and the challenges of the future. In the first section, the word cloud naturally showed the words America, American, citizen, and people as the most used, 30 times. But the next highest used words and concepts were tax and business. Trump ran on his record as a businessman and on tax cuts, so it makes sense that he would discuss those a lot when recapping his first year. When turning to the future, aside from the obvious America words, the highest used in the second half of the speech are MS-13 and gangs. Also, immigration appears a lot. This makes sense when you look at the difference in tone between the first and second parts of the speech. Tone. As I stated earlier, the speech can be divided into two parts: the recap of the previous year's accomplishments, and then the challenges of the future. In general, the tone of these two portions is different as well. The first part is highly congratulatory, upbeat, and optimistic. It talks about the tax cuts, new jobs, and record unemployment. The second half is much darker and discusses our crumbling infrastructure, drugs, immigration, crime, and terrorism. It's not all doom and gloom, but in general has a more foreboding feel than the first half of the speech. Personally, I believe this is intentional, to make what he's already done look good and the future bleak, so that we'll want him to stay in office and make it all better. I wouldn't be surprised if most of the State of the Union speeches have a similar format. Sagan's fallacies. There are three good examples of Carl Sagan's fallacies of logic within the speech. First, the president, while talking about the opioid epidemic and overdose deaths, says we have to get tough on drug dealers. This is begging the question. It assumes that getting tougher on drug dealers will have an effect on overdose deaths, when really the statistics don't bear that out. The US already has higher incarceration rates than most other countries, but still has a drug problem. Another example is Sagan's excluding the middle. During the speech, President Trump implies that the nations that voted against us in acknowledging Jerusalem as Israel's capital are our enemies, excluding the possibility that some of them are our friends who simply disagree with this decision. It's the typical "you're either with us or against us" ultimatum.
My final score. This speech actually has less false information and fewer fallacies than I would have expected, but that is understandable for a speech that is so high profile and probably worked on by many people over a long period of time. Overall, there are more truths than lies, and even with logical fallacies, I would have to rate this speech at least a 2.5 or 3. It's about 60% truthful and 40% false.